integrating ecology, morphology, and behavior in the management of captive populations. And so I think it should be an interesting and relevant presentation to all of you. So I really recommend that you can come, and we'd be interested in your feedback and input on Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray is he's finishing up his PhD right now. Should be done by the end of this semester, and he's at Ohio University right now. Let's see, any questions? We good? All right, so what I'd like to do is just to recap what we were talking about last time. As we were going through this case study, let me actually turn the lights up slightly in the front. I just wrote these up. I know we had a couple other options, but I think we were largely kind of converging on this sort of setup to what we're talking about, where we had this observation that these coot chicks are brightly colored. I passed around this so you can actually see this. We saw the video also. They are just sort of like ridiculously colored, and they have this beautiful bald head with red on it. So the question might be, why are they doing this? So why do they have the bald head, the red bill, but also very bright plumage? They've got yellows and oranges and such covered all over them. So the hypothesis that I think we decided that they were working on is this idea that colorful chicks get fed more by their parents. So if that's true, that would provide an adaptive value to chicks to be brightly colored, and it might be sort of functioning as an indicator, a quality indicator, as your textbook puts it, that describes how these chicks might work and which ones are, maybe the best bet to invest in if you're the parent. So we need to test that idea, and we started to put forth some different kinds of tests we could do. What I want to describe, in fact, I think maybe what we'll do, I'm just going to give you the first little bit without even passing out the form yet. Give me a sec. Coots, coots, coots. Here they are. All right, so I'm just going to read this thing to you. Hamilton studied 90 pairs of coots nesting in the marshes of British Columbia. They decided to try and alter the plumage of the chicks by dyeing them. I think we talked about maybe trying to do something like that. Unfortunately, the dye made the chicks sick, and it removed the oils from their feathers, so they scrapped that idea. They next tried to alter the appearance of the chicks by cutting the orange tips off of their body feathers, and this produced black chicks that seemed to act the same way as normal orange chicks. The scientists now began to test their hypothesis using this technique. So what I'd like you guys to do is group up, and I would suggest even probably circling up so you can actually talk to one another in small groups. I don't care how many, 3, 4, and see if you can design an experiment using this technique that would allow you, and I'm talking like detail about like what groups do you have, what controls do you include, but see if you can design an experiment that would allow you to use this method to test this idea that colorful chicks get fed better by their parents. How would we actually do this? Okay? And I'll just include, maybe I'll tack on to that, include specific discussion of what should be measured. We had some preliminary discussion of that last time, but like what specifically should they be measuring after you have this experimental design in place? So what's the design, and then what should be measured? Cut the tips. You can kind of see, it's kind of just like the tip of each feather that is the colored, and there's sort of a black part that's more proximal. Let's go ahead and do just the black chick nests first, and then we'll come over to our experimental broods here. So and this one, I don't know, like all of these, there's a little bit of a judgment call here. I think I could make two different arguments for these, but where do you think the feeding rates should compare when you have a nest of all black chicks versus a nest of all orange chicks? Should it be the same? Should it be lower? Should it be higher? What do you think? You can call on groups if you'd rather. Can we start here and then we'll just start working? Yeah, so what do you guys think? Why? Yeah, so if you've got, well, does everybody agree? Let's before I start talking. Does everybody agree it should be lower if you've got a nest of all black chicks versus a nest of all orange chicks, that the black chick should be fed less than the orange chicks' nests? You think?
I would kind of think that they'd be given the same rate.
Why?
If it's the entire nest, I mean, food has to be going somewhere from the parents.
Yeah, so I see that point too. So I think you could make two arguments here, I think. One argument I think you could make is that if there's nothing to compare, so if all the chicks are black, then you have nothing to compare based on. You'll still feed and provision at the same rate, and so everybody gets fed at the same rate because nobody looks different from anybody else. And the same, it's kind of the same of the orange chicks nest, in that you'd expect everybody to kind of get the same feeding rate. So you could make an expectation or a prediction that there would be no difference between the nests because there's nothing to compare on and nothing to judge on, so nobody gets sort of biased one way or the other. I think an alternative way, so that's one argument. The alternative expectation would be, and maybe it depends a little bit on how you think this works, if the orange is required to trigger some kind of a feeding response in the parent, then maybe there just won't be triggered as often, and so you might expect overall lower feeding rates. I really don't know which one I would favor more. I guess it sort of depends a little bit on how you think the feeding behavior is working in the parent and how much of, just like a classic instinct fixed action pattern kind of a thing with sign stimulus it is, or is it something where the birds are maybe thinking a little bit more. I don't want to put too much on them, but I think you can make either argument here. And then if we go down to these other ones, we kind of get in the same problem, right? So if we think feeding rate should be the same, then we'd expect the same relative growth rate. Or if you think feeding rate, whoa, hello. I thought I was on the crayon. Come on. There it is. If you expect the same, so you could put your line right there, if I'm just plotting where the median should be. Or if you think that they're not going to get triggered as much to feed, because all these chicks are black now, I think you'd then predict it lower. I think each would be a perfectly reasonable answer. And then the same would be true over here. So if survival, if the black chicks are getting fed just as much as the orange chick nests because there's nothing to differ between them, then we'd put it right there. Otherwise, we might expect lower survival rates for the black chicks. Does that all make sense? Honestly, this is probably harder than the other one. So let's go to the actual experimental brood. So that's the second set over here. So in this case, you've got both orange chicks and black chicks in the same nest. So what would we predict to happen in terms of feeding rate? Should it, compared to a nest where everybody is orange, how would we expect the feeding rates to compare for the orange chicks versus the black chicks? What do you think? Higher, lower, same for the orange chicks? Sorry, I called in Jessica and then I'll jump to you guys. Okay.
And then the black chicks would have a lower, the color for the patty would be slightly lower.
Right. Ah. Yeah, okay, so we'd expect orange chicks to do pretty much just as well, you're saying. I can't seem to do this today. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble. But the black chicks should do worse. Because here you've got a brood where parents are able to compare and they say, well, those orange ones, you know, well, who knows what they're thinking, but the orange ones are present and the black ones are present. We'd expect, based on the hypothesis, the prediction would be the orange ones should get fed more. And so the black ones should do less well. That makes sense to me. Agree, disagrees? I've actually, you know, I think you could maybe even exaggerate here. Not exaggerate, but, you know, an alternative is you could actually predict even a little bit better for the orange chicks. So if this is this idea, if we go back to this idea that if the parents are feeding a finite amount, and so if they always feed the same amount, in this case, everybody's kind of getting fed roughly the same amount. So this is sort of your average. But in this case, we might expect the orange chicks to get better than their share and the black chicks to get worse than their share. So you might actually expect even a little bit higher feeding rates for these orange chicks because there just aren't that many orange ones in the nest. And those might be the ones that the parents invest in. But again, the black ones should be doing worse. So, you know, again, I think you could argue either way for the same or even a little bit better. For the orange chicks in these mixed brood nests. But the black chicks should always be doing worse, right? Because they are, based on the hypothesis, because they are not colorful and therefore they shouldn't be fed as much. And so then we'd probably make the same arguments for growth rate. Orange chicks, I think we'd expect them to be growing just fine, or maybe even a little bit better than fine because they may be getting more than their share of food. But definitely I think we'd expect the black chicks to be doing more poorly. And then as far as survival, again, the orange ones should be doing just fine or maybe even better than fine. This was working so well before. There we go. Whereas the black chicks, you know, they're just those poor guys. They're just not getting fed. So they're probably not going to do as well. You guys agree? All right. So not to belabor the point anymore, here are actual data. So take a look at these and see how you think these compare to the predictions we just made. Should only take a few minutes. Thank you. See what you think. I'll kind of scroll up again. Let's see. If you do note at the bottom of that sheet, it does tell you something about the stats. So there were no significant differences between the orange and black chick control nests. So all of these lines on this side, these are all not statistically different from one another. They did find significant differences between orange and black chicks in the mixed nests, the experimental broods, in feeding growth and survival rates. You will see overlap on this kind of a chart because you're plotting the entire distribution, but especially when you start to see, like the cleanest one is D, where there's no overlap between the sort of that inner quartile range, that main part of the box. That's a good indication there's a statistical difference. I'm actually kind of skeptical on F. I could believe B, but F looks screwy to me. I want to check their stats. I should use the doc cam. So what do you think? Are we supporting, not supporting the hypothesis? Are we consistent with predictions? What's the judge? I got a nod. Yes, no? What do you think? It's pretty good, right? So we're not seeing a dramatic difference between the sort of the uniform nests. So if we look in the nests where everybody's orange versus everybody black, we're seeing basically the same feeding rate, although there's a little bit more variation in the black chick nests. And they had like 40 nests, I think, in this experiment. They have relative growth rate. I mean, that's just like dead on the same. And again, they've got a little more variation in the survival, but they're getting basically the same survival rates between the all black and all orange nests. Where they are seeing differences is when the parents are actually able to compare in these experimental broods. So feeding rate does seem to go down. There's a lot of variation, but we do see a big drop in the median, right? And this was, based on their stats, this was significantly different from one another. I hope they controlled for the differences in variation that they're getting here when they're running their stat program. But again, big drop in feeding rate when you have parents able to compare orange versus black chicks. Similarly, we had a very nice and clean drop in growth rate. Those data are lovely. Survival, I don't know. They're claiming that's different. I mean, survivorship's kind of all over the place. But overall, I mean, my take on this is that these data are pretty nice and consistent with their hypothesis here, that these coloration patterns do seem to be used by parents as a mechanism that triggers them to feed certain chicks more than others. And so, presumably, we have a situation where it's quite to the chick's advantage to have bright orange coloration. And that must be what's driving selection to favor this orange coloration in these chicks. Questions or comments on the study? What do you think? Are you convinced? All right. The one thing I think we could reasonably criticize the study about is that these black chicks, I mean, there's no coot chicks out there that are actually black. They do vary a bit in how orange they are, but there's just, like, you don't find black chicks swimming around out there. So I think you could reasonably criticize the study and say, well, maybe, you know, in this case, yeah, there's a difference, but you've created something here that never exists in nature. And so I think you could make there's sort of a reasonable case there that maybe they've gone outside the range of natural variation, and that anytime you do that, I think you have to be a little bit cautious. But it's still a nice study that I think does a good job of trying to test this hypothesis. I would want to follow it up with more nuanced variation where you're becoming more dull as opposed to just outright just clipping off all the colored feather tips. That's kind of what I'm feeling on this one. All right. I do like that case study quite a bit, though, because I think it is a good way that what would be the advantage of that, because it does kind of fly in the face of what we normally think of as good parenting, right? So that's what this next chapter is, chapter 11, is we're going to be looking at parental behavior in a couple different contexts. And so we're sort of starting with this idea of parental investment tactics. So, and that gets into this case study we just accomplished. So why do we sometimes see parental favoritism? Because that isn't immediately the thing that I think we usually think should happen. In lecture, so that's the case study. And then we come back to that on the homework. So like I said, the homework assignment kind of builds on what we just talked about in lecture. The lecture part here, we're going to be focusing on these two main questions. Why is it that males usually provide less parental care, and when will they provide parental care as we look across animals? And then what are costs and benefits of being a discriminate parent? So we're going to talk a little bit about adoption, and then not necessarily in a human sense, but in the case of animals. And then we're also going to be talking about nest parasitism, because that's one of my favorite topics. It's just great. So, you know, parenting, I think, is really cool. I think this is just a beautiful picture, isn't it? Like this is tender, loving care in a centipede. So you've got Mama Centipede here wrapped around her hatched clutch of all these little baby centipedes, and she's just like, you know, holding them and, you know, comforting them. You do see parental care in all kinds of organisms, and not just the cute and cuddly organisms. I mean, I think centipedes have a certain cuteness to them, but my kids disagree. The parental care in general functions as an adaptation, though, right? So parental care is all about increasing enhancing your offspring survival. There are a number of species that just basically lay their eggs, ditch them, and then never see them again, and that's what they do as far as parenting, is maybe they'll try to find a good nesting site, but that's it, and that's all the offspring get. After that, they're on their own. But those species that do provide parental care are presumably doing so because they're enhancing offspring survival, which then in turn increases the number of their genes that get passed on to the next generation. It's not without cost, though. So I'm going to go back to my little centipede. This centipede could presumably be doing other things. So, she could be off foraging. And oftentimes you see during bouts of parental care, parents will often lose weight. Certainly she could be off seeking other habitat, other environments. She could be seeking additional mating opportunities. She could be investing all of her energy into growing eggs. And instead, she's investing in her brood, who have already hatched here, and putting her eggs in that basket, so to speak. So certainly we see dramatic differences in the way in which parents vary in their parental investment. So we talked about the fact that these American coots show pretty extreme favoritism, and sometimes they neglect and sometimes outright even attack certain individuals within their offspring. So they certainly are not showing equal investment across all of their individual offspring. I'm going to show you the egrets when we talk about the homework, but the thing that's interesting about egrets is that they allow a great deal of siblicide to occur, where they are allowing their sibling, one sibling, to attack another sibling. They could stop it if they wanted, but they just, the parent will be sitting there watching as one of their chicks basically just pecks the other one into submission, or into death. And this is lethal siblicide. So the takeaway from all this, though, in general, is that selection will favor individuals that are parents that are maximizing their reproductive success, not just those who are trying to help every single baby survive. I mean, we kind of like to think that it's all this sort of harmonious, tender, loving care thing that's going on, but selection is not tender and not loving. Selection is about maximizing reproductive success, and so that presumably is what's happening in the case of these coots. Similarly, in the case of siblicide, as we'll see in the egrets on the homework, selection should probably favor chicks that get the most resources, not just those who play nice. And unfortunately, that's kind of the way things are with natural selection. It's this struggle for survival thing that results in some pretty unfair and apparently, seemingly barbaric things happening. There are many varieties of parental behavior. So we certainly, as I mentioned, we see cases where parents offer no care at all. We see many cases where within a species a mother provides a lot of parental care or exclusive care. We do see some cases where fathers provide all the parental care within individual species, and we'll talk about cases like that. And then we'll also talk about cases where you see biparental care, so both parents are contributing. And which approach a given species will use is going to depend on the costs and benefits that it experiences. So if you're trying to understand why a particular species would offer parental care, I think you need to think, and we'll do our typical thing. We'll look at costs and benefits of providing that care. So if females are providing the parental care, they're benefiting, presumably, because they're getting increased offspring survival, but they are paying discrete costs for that. So we already talked about like energy investment, time investment. This is a case, this is an earwig. Hopefully you can see it up here. So these are, kind of cute little bugs. They're named somehow. There's like some rumor that they would crawl into one's ear, and they have these massive cerci that are sort of at the end that make people scared of them, but they're pretty much harmless. But females will basically guard a clutch of eggs for an extended period of time, and by guarding them, they do seem to increase the survivorship of the eggs. There's less predation on this little clutch of eggs that she's laid. But she will end up having to delay her next clutch by about a week versus individuals where if they sort of prevent them from guarding, they move them to a different location where they can't get to those eggs, they'll lay even more, they'll lay faster. And so as a result, they would get better lifetime reproductive success, at least in terms of, I should say, they get better lifetime fecundity. And so they're paying a cost to guard these eggs in terms of less egg laying over their lives, presumably because they're benefiting by increased survivorship of those eggs. Sometimes the costs are even more over. So this is a caecilian. It looks like a big worm, and literally, I mean, have you guys seen these things? So they look like giant earthworms. They're salamanders. Most of them aren't this big, but these are basically kind of like a kind of salamander. They're certainly an amphibian. They're legless. They don't really have much in the way of any kind of obvious head, but this would be the head of the thing. They're kind of weird. They are really weird organisms. But in this case, the mothers actually allow the offspring to chew on their skin. And so this is how she feeds her offspring, is she basically just lets them chew upon. She's got a really lipid-rich skin. This is the jaw structure of a juvenile caecilian. And you can see sort of these sort of teeth-like structures, sort of a rasp-like structure that allows them to scrape her skin off and literally just sort of feed upon her skin. And there's other cases where, like, there are spiders where the mothers basically just let the offspring feed upon her and ultimately cannibalize her as a way of providing some parental care. She's basically providing a meal for her offspring there. So these are obviously major costs. I mean, I guess it's not, maybe it isn't super obvious exactly how much of a cost this is, but certainly, she might do better if she had fully intact skin as opposed to a skin that's being chewed away by her offspring here. We are focusing first on females too. So, males would have the same kind of cost-benefit approach, right? So there would be sort of a cost to providing care, and there'd be benefits to providing care. I think it is kind of interesting. I mean, ultimately, the argument here has to be that the net benefit must be greater than the cost. So she is paying a cost, but they must be gaining more in terms of offspring survivorship than they're paying, and that's why selection favors this behavior. I think it is striking, though, if you compare across animals, how many species it is the case that the females are often providing the bulk of the parental care. There's certainly all kinds of different explanations we could levy to try to understand why is it that females are providing the bulk of the parental care across so many different species. One of the first arguments that a lot of people put forth, and I'll say that this is not supported, but one argument people will sort of put forth is that, well, females are kind of in the business of creating large gametes. So they've already invested a lot in those offspring. And so at that point, they should be biased towards continuing to invest more in them so they don't waste their investment. And really, there's some intuitive appeal to that, but when you start to model that kind of idea and really test the logic of it, it doesn't really pan out. And I mean, there's a couple of reasons why it seems to not work. One is we have all kinds of examples of cases where females do have significant investment in production of the gametes, but then they ditch their eggs and they go off and don't provide any parental care. We even have cases where, there's some discussion in your book, there's a lengthy discussion of it, of these birds where about half the time the females just desert the nest after laying eggs. And some of the time the father sticks around, sometimes they don't. Sometimes, both parents just abandon the entire nest and waste all that investment. So it's not immediately a given that just because you invest prior resources in it, that you're going to have continued investment in those offspring. And I think a little bit of this, your book, I like to make this claim that it kind of relates to this idea of a sunk cost, where, have you guys heard of sunk costs? This is like a business idea. But the idea is that if you've been investing in something for a while, that doesn't mean you should keep investing in it. That doesn't mean that that's always the logical outcome so that you don't have some past loss. Because sometimes it's just better to give up. So you could have, in a business standpoint, for example, you could start a restaurant, invest a ton of resources into it, give it your all, and ultimately you could be looking at their bottom line. It's just not working, right? I mean, you could be just continuing to suffer loss after loss, month after month. At a certain point, it's time to cut the cord, and you just have to make a decision that, it's time to move on and just give up on the fact that you've invested all that in it. It's better to treat that as a sunk cost, because either way, you're kind of where you are. So you could either make a decision to cut your losses, or you could keep investing in that thing. And at a certain point, you probably should just cut losses. And the same may be true here, that just because you've already invested a lot of resources in production of this offspring, that doesn't mean that you should continue to invest all of your time and energy into them if perhaps that's not going to be beneficial to you. So instead, I think we need to find other explanations for why females are usually the ones across most animal species that are doing parental care, if parental care is being done at all. And there's a couple of reasons for it. One of them is that females probably are paying lower costs than males are, or somehow they're getting greater benefits from providing the parental care. And here are a couple of reasons why that might be. One is that after females lay eggs, they often, most species are egg laying, so I'm going with the sort of idea of laying eggs. That's a huge resource investment. And you only have finite capacity in your body to produce eggs. So oftentimes, after you've laid a whole batch of them, you need time to build up the resources and take the time to resynthesize all of those eggs before you're able to lay your next clutch. And so you often cannot immediately effectively remate and reproduce again right after laying. So there may be kind of some downtime anyway. And if there's already some downtime for you, perhaps you can use that time better if you invest in parental care than if you just go off and ditch your prior clutch and try to find food and focus on that particular outcome. Sorry about my phone. Females also have a situation that's different from males in that if they mate multiple times, as we've seen before, they don't necessarily get more offspring, but they can still get genetically diverse offspring. So, one of the arguments has been that maybe females would benefit by mating right away, trying to produce another clutch right away with a different male, so they can have different sets of genetically different sets of offspring. And a way to ameliorate that is that if the female mates multiple times, so if she's polyandrous, she may be able to secure genetic diversity in just one clutch without really needing to seek out that second clutch. So this seems to be way that females can sort of mediate the need to go off and find additional matings. Also, and this is probably a big one, females are pretty much guaranteed parenting. They're guaranteed paternity, if you will. They're guaranteed to be the parents of offspring. So if they lay those eggs, those are their offspring, right? And there's really usually no ambiguity between that. So the females are always pretty much aware of who is their baby and who is not their baby. Whereas males, that's not necessarily the case. Oftentimes you will have, if you have internal fertilization, there may be multiple males around. If you have external fertilization, you may have sneaker males coming up and presenting sperm that are competing with yours. And so males often have less of a payout. So in this way, any parental care that females provide are more likely to directly affect her offspring. Whereas if males provide parental care, there's a chance that they're helping their own offspring, but there's a chance they're helping some other male's offspring. And so then they're not gaining genetic benefits from that. And so if that's true, selection should not favor male parental care as much as it should favor female parental care. Does that make sense? I kind of like that idea. So for all of these reasons, and again, I think the assurance of paternity is probably maybe the biggest one, but these other ones probably come into play as well in many species. Females probably are the ones that are most likely to provide parental care in any given situation. But certainly there are cases where males are providing parental care. And there's frankly a lot of these cases, and some of them are kind of almost hilarious. So this thing is called a Randall's jawfish. So this is a male, and it's hard to see on this picture, but loaded into his mouth is not food. This is all eggs. So basically the female laid her eggs in his mouth, and he is now protecting them in his mouth and will keep them there in his mouth. He won't be able to feed during this entire time. But as long as it's usually a few days at least that the eggs are in there, they're developing, and then they will hatch and emerge. And this entire time, he's holding them there and providing parental care in the form of protection. So this is one form of parental care that males can provide. And in this situation, I guess I'm just like to think about how might something like this evolve. Not so much of the whole, why is he putting all of his eggs in his mouth behavior, because I think that's kind of interesting. But if we just sort of compare a parental male that's doing something to help his offspring survival and a non-parental male who's just not doing anything. So here are two different strategies you could sort of imagine that males could pursue. In the parental male, let's imagine that he mates with one female who lays a total of 10 eggs. That's a big exaggeration or underestimate based on here, because this has got to be hundreds. But I'm just trying to keep the math easy. So let's say the one female, she lays 10 eggs. He's got a 40% chance of fathering any given egg from his mate. So there's other males around. He's not necessarily guaranteed paternity. And let's say his parental care results in 50% survivorship of the eggs. So that's one approach. And we could basically look at all that and try to figure out how much fitness is he getting from his parental care efforts. Here's a non-parental male. So in a non-parental male, because they're not providing parental care, they can seek out additional matings with additional females. So let's say he gets to mate with 5 females, each of whom make 10 eggs, so he gets a total of 50 eggs fathered by him. So that's a good thing. The male has a 40% chance of fathering any given egg with his mate, so he's not gaining anything in terms of paternity. Same chance of being the father. There's other males around. But because he's not providing parental care, there's 10% survivorship of the eggs. So what I'd like you to try to do is use this to calculate who's winning out, who's getting the most copies of his genes effectively into the next generation, or who's having the most, maybe even without, we don't even have to go to the genes level. Let's just figure out how many of this male's offspring make it to the next generation, and how many of this male's offspring make it to the next generation. And I think you can figure out that just from these depictions. So like, take a minute, work between you, talk amongst yourselves, see if you can figure out an estimate for how many offspring this guy should get and how many offspring this guy should get as a way to tell which one would be the optimal behavior. Maybe I'm going to change the instructions a little. So they're effectively equal. Yeah, go ahead. How so? Yeah, so it'd be cool if we could figure out a way to wrap that into one of the variables that we have up here. So if parental care it costs more energy, one thing I think we could probably expect is that his parental care is going to get less effective. So as we start to increase the energy cost of being a parent, he might not be able to just support the offspring as well, so survivorship of offspring could go down. So if the survivorship of the offspring, if the effectiveness of his parenting goes down because it's too darn costly to actually do it well, that's going to result in less surviving, which means instead of 4 eggs surviving, or instead of 2 eggs surviving here, maybe it goes down to 1 egg. And if that happens, all of a sudden being a parent is not as advantageous as being a non-parental male. What else could we futz with up here? I like that. Be nice, right? I mean, I guess it's not necessarily guaranteed, but that does mean if this number goes up, if there's something about hanging out with one, maybe if you're hanging out with one female, so you're only mating with one, but maybe you're guarding her. So maybe she's going to mate with fewer additional males. So that might mean that your percent of paternity should go up. And if that's true, that then tilts the balance where, this calculation might go from 10 eggs, maybe, here we only said that he had 4. Maybe he gets 6. And if he gets 6 and 50% survive, now all of a sudden he's got 3 eggs. And being a parent is more advantageous. So yeah, so as the chance of fathering any given egg increases, if that increases as being part of a parent, then that should result in better, or in selection favoring parentage. Anybody see a different one? Another thing we could futz with? The parent. So if instead of 10%, this starts to drop because there's more predators around. Whereas this guy, if he's able to be a parent that provides better protection against those predators, so if this number goes up, then that should or if this number goes down, that should tilt the balance in favor of being a parent. I like that. So I think this is kind of the point, though, is that these are some of the critical things that affects the decision about whether or not to be a parent or not. It's what's your likelihood of being the parent, your paternity chance, how many offspring are you getting, total, so how many mates do you actually get, and then how does your parenting affect the survivorship versus not providing any parental care of the offspring. And those are like 3 critical variables that are going to impact the decision about how selection should drive males to be either parents or not parents. Another thing we could say up here is that if there's some way that parental males could mate with more than one female still, even as they're providing parental care, that should be advantageous to them too, and might tilt the balance towards being a parent. So in the case of those jawfish, that unfortunately doesn't really happen. They can only hold 1 clutch of eggs at a time. Their jaw is only so big. But there are a lot of species of fish in which they actually can do a little bit of this. Let me dim the lights again. I just have a minute left, but I want to talk about this. So here are the same things we were just sort of saying. So if there's some way that you can have greater offspring survivorship payoff by being a parent, that'll tilt the balance towards being a parent a little bit more, make that more likely. If you have increased likelihood of paternity when mating, because maybe you're guarding your female, or maybe there's some other reason that she's less likely to mate with other males if you're providing good parental care. If you have the ability to mate more than once while doing parental care, that should make it easier for males to be a parent. They're not paying as much of a cost in terms of opportunities for matings. Another one that we didn't really mention, and it doesn't fit as well into that framework though, but if you have lower overall likelihood of some future mating opportunity. So, we're always assuming if males aren't providing parenting, they should be able to go off and find other mates. Maybe that's unlikely to happen. So what if there's really high predation of males in a population? So a lot of male spiders, for example, experience high predation. So if they find a female, it's best to just stick with that female and go with what you have rather than trying to find something else. Or maybe, otherwise females are just highly dispersed and difficult to locate. A neat example where you see some of this happening are in stickleback fish, where males will defend little nests of eggs. The nests can hold multiple clutches, so they can acquire up to 10 different clutches of eggs in their nest. So that's 10 different females coming in laying eggs in that nest. And females will actually choose males based on their parenting skills, as well as the number of eggs already in the nest. So if they find a male that has good vigorous displays that are indicative of good parenting behavior and lots of eggs already in his nest, but still room for more, she's very likely to choose that male. And so under those circumstances, the males are still getting reproductive opportunities and they're gaining the benefits of being a parent. And so in these cases, these males are really good parents, and they do provide really good parental care for their offspring, in part because they're not really paying much of a negative cost in terms of missed reproductive opportunities for doing so. All right, so we have to stop there. We'll pick up there.